When empires write their histories in gold, they often forget to mention that the ink was mixed with blood. The Ottoman Empire, spanning 6 centuries and 3 continents, built its legacy not just through military conquest, but through a systematized machinery of human suffering that transformed the wives and daughters of defeated warriors into commodities of imperial expansion. What you are about to discover is not merely a tale of ancient cruelty, but a methodically organized system that turned female captivity into state policy, documented with the same precision as tax records and trade agreements. The fall of Constantinople in 1453 marked more than the end of the Byzantine Empire. It inaugurated an era where the capture and enslavement of women became as integral to Ottoman warfare as gunpowder and siege tactics. Behind the celebrated military victories and architectural marvels lies a darker truth that historians have only recently begun to fully examine. A vast network of female enslavement that reshaped demographics, destroyed cultures, and left scars that persist in collective memory across Eastern Europe, the Balkans, and the Middle East to this day. This is not a story of random acts of wartime violence, but rather of calculated imperial policy executed with bureaucratic efficiency. The Ottoman system of female captivity, known as the devshirme for boys and the harem system for women, was codified in law, sanctioned by religious authorities, and administered by a complex hierarchy of officials whose sole purpose was to process human beings like merchandise. Every captured woman's fate was meticulously recorded in ledgers that still exist in archives from Istanbul to Vienna. Their lives reduced to entries of age, origin, physical description, and market value. The practice reached its zenith during the 16th and 17th centuries, when Ottoman expansion was at its peak. From the plains of Hungary to the shores of the Black Sea, from the Arabian Peninsula to the gates of Vienna, millions of women found themselves caught in a web of systematic oppression that was as psychologically devastating as it was physically brutal. Their stories, long silenced or romanticized in Orientalist fantasies, reveal the true cost of empire building, measured not in territories gained, but in lives destroyed. What makes this historical examination particularly chilling is the realization that this was not the product of barbarism or lack of civilization, but rather the opposite. The Ottoman Empire was one of the most sophisticated and administratively advanced states of its time. Its treatment of captured women was not a failure of its system, but a deliberate feature, refined over centuries and exported as a model to other expanding powers. The bureaucratization of human suffering reached levels that would not be seen again until the totalitarian regimes of the 20th century. As we delve into this dark chapter of history, we must confront uncomfortable truths about how empires maintain power through the subjugation of the most vulnerable. The Ottoman practice of systematically capturing, converting, and exploiting the wives of defeated enemies was not an anomaly in human history, but rather an extreme example of how states can institutionalize cruelty while maintaining a veneer of civilization and even piety. The evidence comes from multiple sources: Ottoman administrative records, European diplomatic correspondence, survivor testimonies preserved in monastery archives, and archaeological findings from slave markets across the former empire. Each document, each artifact, each hastily scrawled plea for help smuggled out of a harem tells part of a larger story that challenges our understanding of one of history's most powerful empires. The roots of Ottoman female captivity stretch back to the earliest days of Islamic expansion, but the Ottomans transformed what had been sporadic practice into industrial-scale operation. The theological justification came from interpretations of Islamic law regarding the treatment of non-Muslim populations in conquered territories. The concept of Dar al-Harb, the realm of war, versus Dar al-Islam, the realm of Islam, provided the legal framework for treating non-Muslim women as legitimate spoils of war, or ghanima. Unlike their Arab predecessors who often integrated captured populations through various means, the Ottomans developed a highly structured system that maximized both economic profit and social control. The practice was codified during the reign of Murad I in the 14th century and reached its most elaborate form under Suleiman the Magnificent in the 16th century. Legal texts from this period, particularly the Qanunnameh, Book of Laws, explicitly outlined the procedures for processing, pricing, and distributing captured women. The geographic scope of this system was staggering. Ottoman raids called Ghazu or Akın regularly penetrated deep into Christian territories, specifically to capture women and children. The Crimean Khanate, an Ottoman vassal state, conducted annual slave raids into Poland, Russia, and Ukraine that depopulated entire regions. Historical estimates suggest that between the 15th and 18th centuries, over 3 million people from Eastern Europe alone were enslaved through this system, with women comprising the majority. The religious authorities played a crucial role in legitimizing these practices. Fatwas from the Sheikh ul-Islam, the highest religious authority in the Ottoman Empire, consistently upheld the legality of enslaving non-Muslim women captured in warfare. These religious endorsements were not merely passive acceptance, but active encouragement, with religious texts arguing that bringing infidel women into Muslim households was a form of divine mercy that offered them salvation through conversion. The mechanics of systematic capture reveal the calculated nature of Ottoman expansion. Raids were military operations planned with the same precision as major battles, but with a different objective: human acquisition rather than territorial control. Tatar and Ottoman raiders developed refined tactics for surprise attacks on villages and small towns, timing their incursions for maximum efficiency. They struck during harvest season, when grain stores were full and communities were concentrated in fields, or during religious festivals when entire populations gathered in churches and town squares. These raids moved with shocking speed. Raiders surrounded settlements before dawn, cutting off escape routes and systematically rounding up women and children while eliminating any male resistance. The separation of families was immediate and deliberate, as raiders understood that family bonds would inspire desperate resistance. Husbands were killed before their wives' eyes, children torn from mothers' arms, elderly family members who couldn't survive. Forced marches were executed on the spot. Contemporary accounts from both victims and participants describe scenes of calculated horror. A Venetian diplomat's report from 1571 details a raid on a Croatian village where raiders herded women into the church, set fire to the building, and then pulled out only the young women, leaving the elderly and children to burn. Polish chronicles from the 17th century describe raids so thorough that entire districts were left with only elderly men, all women and children having been taken. Ukrainian folk songs preserved memories of villages where the church bells rang, but no women came, their absence a void that echoed through generations. The journey from capture to slave market was designed to break spirits before sale. Women were chained together in long columns, forced to march hundreds of miles with minimal food and water. Those who fell from exhaustion were either left to die or killed outright, as their economic value didn't justify the delay they caused. Guards used rape as a weapon of control, with religious authorities providing convenient justification that captive women were permissible for sexual use even before formal sale. The mortality rate during these forced marches was horrific. Historical records suggest that 20–30% of captives died during transport, their bodies left along well-traveled routes that became known as roads of bones. Survivors described walking past decomposing corpses of women who had been in their own village just days before, a psychological torment that added to the physical agony of the march. Upon reaching major slave markets in Constantinople, Kaffa, Damascus, or Cairo, women underwent dehumanizing inspection processes designed to assess their market value. They were stripped naked in public, examined for physical defects, tested for virginity, and categorized by age, appearance, and perceived fertility. Market inspectors, operating under official Ottoman authority, documented each woman in official ledgers, assigning market values based on criteria that reduced human beings to livestock. The categorization system was elaborate and coldly efficient. Young virgins, especially those with fair complexions, commanded premium prices and were marked for sale to wealthy households or the imperial harem. Women with useful skills like weaving, music, or literacy were valued for specialized service. Mothers with young children were categorized as low value, as children were seen as economic burdens. The elderly or infirm were often not even brought to market, killed during the journey as economically unviable. The auction process itself was ritualized humiliation. Women stood on raised platforms while potential buyers examined them like merchandise, checking teeth for health, feeling muscles for strength, demanding demonstrations of skills. Buyers discussed women's merits and flaws openly, debating their worth as if they were deaf animals incapable of understanding their own dehumanization. Families were separated without ceremony. Children sold to different buyers than their mothers, siblings dispersed across the empire, never to see each other again. This systematic destruction of family bonds was not a byproduct of the system, but a deliberate strategy to prevent organized resistance and eliminate cultural continuity. Once sold, a woman's fate depended on her buyer's status and intentions. The fortunate minority entered wealthy households where, after forced conversion to Islam, they might eventually gain some limited privileges as domestic servants. Many of these women, especially those sold as children, eventually internalized their captivity, raising their own children as Muslims with no memory of their original heritage. But the majority faced far darker destinies. Many were purchased for agricultural labor in Anatolia or the Balkans, working in conditions of brutal hardship until they died from exhaustion or disease. Others were sold to brothels, serving the empire's armies, enduring systematic rape until they were no longer profitable, at which point they were typically abandoned to die. The worst fate might have been domestic servitude in poor or middle-class households, where women endured constant physical abuse, sexual exploitation, and had no hope of ever gaining freedom or status. The imperial harem system represented the pinnacle of this organized exploitation, yet it was simultaneously the most mythologized and least understood aspect of Ottoman female enslavement. Western Orientalist fantasies portrayed the harem as a luxurious paradise of willing concubines, but the reality was a prison where thousands of women competed for the sultan's attention under constant threat of violence, maintained by a complex hierarchy of guards, eunuchs, and senior concubines. Women entered the imperial harem through various routes, as war captives, as gifts from provincial governors seeking favor, or as purchases from slave markets. Upon arrival, they were renamed, converted to Islam through elaborate and humiliating rituals, and trained in the complex protocols of harem life. This training, which could last years, was designed to erase their former identities and reconstruct them as tools of Ottoman power. The harem hierarchy was ruthlessly enforced. At the top sat the Valide Sultan, the Sultan's mother, who wielded tremendous power over the fates of all other women. Below her were the Sultan's favorites and the mothers of his children, who maintained their positions through constant political maneuvering. The vast majority of harem women never saw the Sultan, instead spending their entire lives in service to higher-ranking concubines, performing menial labor or teaching younger captives. Competition for the Sultan's attention was vicious and often lethal. Women poisoned rivals, spread rumors, and formed alliances that shifted constantly. Those who bore sons gained tremendous status and protection, while those who failed to attract the Sultan's notice or who bore only daughters faced lives of obscurity and eventual disposal. When a new Sultan took the throne, The former sultan's concubines, who had not borne children, were typically sent to the Old Palace, a grim institution where they lived out their days in enforced seclusion, forbidden from ever leaving or marrying. The conversion process was systematic cultural genocide. Women were forced to renounce their original religions through elaborate rituals designed to humiliate and break psychological resistance. They received new Muslim names, often meaningless designations like Moonlight or Ruby, that stripped away their family histories. They were taught to speak Turkish while being forbidden from using their native languages, even in private conversation. They were indoctrinated in Islamic practice under threat of torture, forced to perform prayers and recitations that contradicted everything they had been raised to believe. This forced assimilation was intended to make return to their original communities impossible. A Christian woman who had publicly converted to Islam and born Muslim children could never go home, even if she somehow escaped, as she would be considered an apostate and collaborator. The Ottomans understood that destroying a woman's ability to return home was as effective as physical chains in ensuring permanent captivity. Yet, despite overwhelming odds, resistance persisted in countless forms. Some women chose death over enslavement, committing suicide during raids or on the march to slave markets. Orthodox Christian texts from the period elevated these women to martyrdom, preserving their names and stories as examples of faithfulness unto death. Others engaged in slower, more persistent forms of resistance. They maintained secret religious practices, hiding Christian crosses or Jewish prayer books at tremendous personal risk. They whispered prayers in their native languages when guards weren't listening. They taught their children songs and stories from their homeland, creating networks of memory that preserved fragments of erased cultures across generations. The most remarkable testimonies come from women who managed to maintain their faith for decades despite constant pressure. Court records from 1623 describe a Greek woman who had been enslaved for 25 years but still refused to eat meat during Orthodox fast periods, a defiance that was only discovered when she became seriously ill and confessed to a sympathetic servant. Her execution for apostasy was documented with bureaucratic precision, her decades of quiet resistance reduced to a single line in official records. Documentation of resistance appears throughout Ottoman archives, though always from the perspective of authorities dealing with problems rather than humans maintaining their dignity. Court records detail women who attempted escape, refused conversion, or even attacked their captors. Each documented case represents countless undocumented acts of defiance, as most resistance was crushed before it could be recorded. The most haunting testimonies come from European slaves who eventually gained freedom and recorded their experiences. These accounts, preserved in monastery archives and diplomatic correspondence, describe years of suffering in vivid, heart-wrenching detail. They speak of watching children grow up not knowing their true heritage, of midnight gatherings where women taught each other prayers in forbidden languages, of desperate escape attempts that usually ended in brutal punishment or death. One particularly moving account comes from a Hungarian noblewoman captured in 1552 who was eventually ransomed after 8 years of captivity. Her written testimony describes watching her 2 daughters, captured with her, gradually forget their native language and Christian faith. She describes the agony of knowing they would never be ransomed, having been sold to different masters and dispersed across the empire. She describes her own moment of despair when, during a secret Christian prayer she whispered at night, she realized she could no longer remember all the words in Hungarian. The economic scale of this system was staggering and provides perhaps the clearest evidence of its systematic nature. The slave trade became one of the Ottoman Empire's major revenue sources, generating annual income comparable to the tax revenue from entire provinces. Major slave markets operated with the efficiency of modern financial centers, complete with standardized pricing, quality grading, and even futures contracts for expected captures from upcoming raids. Constantinople's slave market, located near the present-day Grand Bazaar, processed thousands of women annually at its peak in the 16th century. Market prices were carefully documented and adjusted based on supply, demand, and the woman's characteristics. A young, attractive Circassian woman might sell for 150 gold coins, equivalent to several years' wages for a skilled craftsman. An older woman, or one with children, might fetch only 10-15 coins, barely more than the cost of livestock. The empire's economic dependence on slavery created powerful constituencies resistant to reform, even as international pressure mounted. Merchants who grew wealthy from the trade, officials who collected taxes on sales, provincial governors who received bribes to facilitate raids, religious authorities who justified the practice, and countless households that depended on enslaved labor, all had vested interests in maintaining the system. The personal stories that emerge from archives are heartbreaking in their specific details. A ledger from 1587 mentions Katerina, Polish, age 16, virgin, light hair, sold for 145 gold coins to the household of Ibrahim Pasha. That single line represents an entire universe of suffering that official documentation can barely suggest. A young woman torn from her family, forced to march hundreds of miles, sold like cattle, and condemned to a life of servitude under a new name in a foreign land. Another record from 1632 describes a Greek Orthodox priest's wife who maintained secret Christian worship for 20 years before discovery and execution. The bureaucratic notation of her death provides no hint of the courage required to maintain her faith for 2 decades under constant threat, or the psychological torment of raising her own children as Muslims while secretly believing they were damned. International responses to Ottoman slavery evolved over centuries, but remained tragically inadequate until the empire's collapse. European powers engaged in elaborate diplomatic dances, publicly condemning slavery while privately participating in slave markets and using the threat of liberation to extract political concessions from the Ottomans. Christian religious orders, particularly Trinitarians and Mercedarians, organized ransom efforts, collecting money from European Christians to buy freedom for individual slaves. These operations saved thousands of lives over the centuries, but barely dented the system's massive scope. The politics of ransom created its own moral complexities. Families in Eastern Europe bankrupted themselves trying to ransom captured daughters, while raiders learned to target wealthy families, specifically because they would pay higher ransoms. Some Christian captives were ransomed multiple times, captured again in subsequent raids, in a cycle that enriched both Ottoman raiders and Christian ransomers. The ransom system, meant as humanitarian intervention, arguably incentivized more raids by making captives more valuable. European diplomatic correspondence reveals the cynical calculations behind official responses to Ottoman slavery. A Venetian ambassador's report from 1573 coldly analyzes whether agitating for slave liberation would damage trade relations, concluding that commercial interests outweighed humanitarian concerns. A French diplomatic memo from 1689 discusses using enslaved French citizens as bargaining chips in treaty negotiations, treating their suffering as political leverage rather than moral urgency. The abolition of Ottoman slavery was neither clean nor complete, but rather a prolonged process marked by false starts, deliberate evasions, and final atrocities. International pressure following the Crimean War forced Sultan Abdulmajid to issue an 1854 decree restricting the slave trade, but enforcement was minimal and loopholes were deliberately preserved. The decree banned the public display of slaves for sale and prohibited the enslavement of certain populations, but private sales continued unabated and enforcement officials were systematically bribed to ignore violations. The 1857 Slave Trade Treaty with Britain promised more comprehensive reform, but was systematically evaded through creative interpretation and bureaucratic delay. The Ottoman government claimed to be implementing reforms while simultaneously instructing local officials to ignore violations. Market inspectors, who had previously certified slave sales under official authority, now did the same work unofficially, receiving payments directly from merchants rather than official salaries. The Young Turk Revolution of 1908 brought promises of comprehensive reform, including the complete abolition of slavery. However, the revolutionary government, facing multiple crises and wars, largely abandoned these commitments when it became clear that enforcing abolition would create powerful enemies. The formal closure of Constantinople's slave market in 1909 was celebrated as a great victory, but private sales continued with government knowledge. The revolution's failure to address female slavery revealed how even radical political change could leave fundamental oppression intact when challenging it threatened too many vested interests. World War I and its aftermath created chaos that both accelerated abolition and enabled final atrocities. The Ottoman defeat meant the empire could no longer resist international pressure for abolition. However, the war also provided cover for the disposal of enslaved women who might provide evidence of Ottoman crimes. The Armenian genocide included the systematic enslavement of tens of thousands of Armenian women and girls, showing how practices supposedly being abolished were actually being expanded under the chaos of war. The transition from empire to republic was marked by the disappearance of thousands of enslaved women, whose fate remains unknown. Some historians suggest they were killed to prevent their testimony about their enslavement. Others believe they were simply abandoned, left to die in the chaos of the empire's collapse. The lack of documentation about their fate is itself revealing, suggesting a deliberate effort to erase evidence of the system's final phase. The Republic of Turkey's approach to the slavery legacy was characterized by denial and erasure rather than acknowledgement and restitution. Mustafa Kemal Atatürk's modernization program required distancing the new state from Ottoman practices, but this was achieved through historical revisionism rather than honest reckoning. Official histories minimized or ignored the scope of Ottoman slavery, portraying it as a marginal practice rather than a central institution. Former slaves were given theoretical freedom, but no support, compensation, or acknowledgement of their suffering. Many women, especially those who had been enslaved since childhood, had nowhere to go and no way to support themselves. They remained in servitude under different names, now called domestic servants or household help, in a semantic shift that changed little about their actual conditions. The absence of any reparations program or even official recognition meant that women who had suffered decades of enslavement simply became invisible in the new republic. The legacy of incomplete abolition persists in various forms throughout former Ottoman territories. Domestic servitude arrangements that closely echo historical slavery continue in some regions, with women working in conditions of near-total control by employers. The stigma attached to descent from enslaved women affects social standing and marriage prospects in communities with long memories. Families in the Balkans and Eastern Europe still know which surnames indicate descent from women who returned from Ottoman captivity, and this knowledge influences social relationships centuries later. As we reach the conclusion of this dark journey through one of history's most systematic and cruel institutions of oppression, we must confront the uncomfortable truth that the Ottoman enslavement of women was not an aberration, but rather an extreme manifestation of practices that continue to plague humanity. The estimated 3 to 5 million women who suffered under this system across 5 centuries represent not just statistics, but entire civilizations' worth of human potential destroyed, families obliterated, and cultures erased. The Ottoman system's most chilling aspect was not its cruelty, but its normalization. For centuries, the buying and selling of women, the rape and torture of captives, and the destruction of families was treated as routine administrative practice, no more remarkable than tax collection or trade regulation. This normalization was achieved through a combination of religious justification, legal codification, bureaucratic efficiency, and economic incentive that transformed atrocity into banality. The lesson for our contemporary world is clear. Evil becomes most dangerous when it becomes systematic, when it is wrapped in the language of law and order, when it becomes somebody's job rather than somebody's crime. The Ottoman officials who processed enslaved women were not individual monsters, but ordinary bureaucrats, following established procedures. The merchants who sold them were respectable businessmen operating legal enterprises. The religious authorities who justified the practice were learned scholars applying accepted interpretations of law. The voices of the enslaved women themselves, preserved in fragments through survivor testimonies, court records, and archaeological evidence, speak across centuries to demand recognition. Each scratched message on a cell wall, each secretly preserved religious artifact, each song passed from mother to daughter in whispered defiance, represents an act of resistance against erasure. These women were not passive victims, but active resistors who fought to maintain their humanity against a system designed to destroy it. The complicity of entire societies in maintaining this system of oppression carries contemporary relevance. Thousands of people participated in the enslavement of women, not because they were uniquely evil, but because the system made participation normal, profitable, and even seemingly moral. Merchants, soldiers, bureaucrats, judges, and religious authorities all played roles in perpetuating suffering, while likely considering themselves good people living according to their society's norms. This historical example demands we examine our own participation in systems that might be causing suffering we choose not to see. How many contemporary injustices do we participate in through similar mechanisms of normalization, legal sanction, and economic incentive? What future generations will look back at our society and wonder how we could have been so complicit in obvious evil? The international community's delayed and insufficient response to Ottoman female enslavement offers sobering lessons about the politics of humanitarian intervention. For centuries, European powers knew about the suffering, but acted only when it served their political interests. Even then, their interventions were limited, selective, and often hypocritical, given their own participation in various forms of slavery and colonialism. The failure to prevent centuries of systematic abuse, despite ample knowledge and capability, demonstrates that awareness alone is insufficient. Action requires political will that often conflicts with economic and strategic interests. The nations that eventually pressured the Ottoman Empire to abolish slavery did so not from pure humanitarian motives, but because slavery had become a useful diplomatic leverage point. Their concern extended only as far as their interests required. The incomplete nature of justice for Ottoman slavery's victims reflects a pattern that continues today. The empire fell, the institution was abolished, but the women who suffered received no compensation, no acknowledgement, and no justice. Their descendants carry trauma never addressed, living in societies that prefer to forget rather than confront historical crimes. This absence of transitional justice, truth-telling, and reparations has left wounds that continue to fester, influencing contemporary conflicts and social problems in ways rarely acknowledged. The methods pioneered by the Ottoman system for controlling populations through the systematic abuse of women have proven terrifyingly durable, reappearing in various forms throughout the 20th and 21st centuries. From the comfort women of Imperial Japan to the Yazidi women enslaved by ISIS, from the rape camps of Bosnia to the trafficking networks that operate globally today, the ghost of Ottoman methodology haunts contemporary atrocities. Understanding this historical continuity is essential for recognizing that such systems are not inevitable or natural, but constructed, and therefore can be dismantled. The Ottoman system didn't emerge spontaneously, but was deliberately created through specific policy decisions, legal frameworks, and institutional structures. This means that similar systems operating today are equally deliberate constructions that can be identified, opposed, and destroyed. As we close this examination, we must hold in our consciousness both the magnitude of suffering inflicted and the strength of those who endured it. The Ottoman enslavement of women represents one of history's greatest crimes against humanity, a centuries-long atrocity that destroyed millions of lives and warped the development of entire civilizations. The demographic impact alone reshaped regions, creating gender imbalances and cultural disruptions that persisted for generations. Yet this history also represents the ultimate failure of oppression to completely destroy the human spirit. In every act of resistance, every preserved memory, every child who survived to carry forward their mother's story, we see proof that even the most systematic evil cannot entirely extinguish humanity's light. The women who suffered under Ottoman slavery demonstrated extraordinary courage in maintaining their dignity, faith, and cultural identity against overwhelming pressure to abandon everything that defined them. The women who suffered under Ottoman slavery deserve more than our pity. They deserve our commitment to ensuring that such systematic evil never again becomes normalized, bureaucratized, and accepted as the price of empire. They deserve our acknowledgement of their suffering, our study of how such systems operate, and our vigilance against similar mechanisms in our own time. Their stories, rescued from centuries of silence and distortion, stand as testimony that empires are built not just on military might and economic prowess, but on the crushed lives of the most vulnerable. Every great palace, every celebrated conquest, every period of Ottoman glory rested on a foundation of women's suffering. Acknowledging this truth doesn't diminish our understanding of history, but completes it, forcing us to see the full cost of the monuments and institutions we study. The legacy of Ottoman female enslavement challenges us to look beyond official histories and magnificent architecture to see the human cost of empire. It demands that we ask hard questions about how suffering becomes systematized, how ordinary people become complicit in extraordinary evil, and how societies can be structured to make cruelty normal. Most importantly, it requires us to recognize that the systems that enabled this atrocity were not ancient mysteries, but documented, understandable mechanisms that continue to operate in different forms today. Only by truly understanding how the Ottoman Empire turned the enslavement of women into an industrial system can we recognize and resist similar mechanisms in our own world. The bureaucrats, merchants, and officials who made this system function were not different from us. They had families, believed in their religion, saw themselves as moral people. Yet they participated in one of history's most sustained atrocities. Their example should terrify us into vigilance about our own potential for complicity in systems of suffering we choose not to see.